Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and to our study in Walter Kaufmann's take on Hegel and his little mini reader. That's what it really is. It's a 120-page mini reader on selected passages in Hegel's Phenomenology. We're going to look at Hegel's epistemology in this lesson, and when you think about it, Hegel's entire system is epistemology. So to say that we're going to look at Hegel's epistemology is a little odd because there's no separate epistemology in Hegel at all. His entire system is epistemology. How do we come to know what we know? How do we come to know in an absolute spiritual way? His entire system is epistemology. But this selection that Kaufmann has given us gives us a very focused look at Hegel and epistemology. Let's get started and go to block 1. Okay, block 1. The 3 moments of the element of knowledge. In itself, it is self-recognition in absolute otherness as the base of knowledge, and it becomes perfected through the process of becoming. Then it goes out of itself as a process of becoming, as thinking in the spirit, where essence is reflected back into itself, and where the self is elevated into the ether spirit. I love that. Where the self is elevated into the ether of spirit. Then we have the return for the self as being elevated to the ether of spirit. Scientific method becomes the form or the ladder to attain to the spiritual standpoint. This form of the true is considered individual, reaching certainty of the self. Very good little logic there in block 1. I liked all of it. And now we move into block 2 and looking at that process of becoming. And for Hegel, that is his phenomenology itself. So Kaufmann begins, what is phenomenology? And there are 3 aspects of phenomenology. The other of objective spirit also speaks to our own self-identity. The substance of spirit becomes transfigured as subject of spirit, as reflection of essence back into itself. There you go again. 2, the process of becoming as a transfiguration of spirit. By ascending the spiritual ladder that leads from sense certainty, where we begin, to absolute knowledge, into the ether of spirit, where self-consciousness becomes scientific in its approach. Block 2, note 3, self-consciousness reaches certainty of the self. Certainty of the self. The in itself of the true does enter the realm of positing, and it posits its sign model. It posits itself in order to become a recognition for the self. The spiritual ascent of the self is Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. That's what it's all about. Philosophy becomes science and represents Hegel's entire phenomenology. And the self reaches the level of pure concept. The level of pure concept, where we reach that imprinting of the conscience with the overarching idea, capital I. For Hegel, what is that idea? The speculative Good Friday as the negation of the negative. We've talked about that before. For Hegel, the overarching idea, the pure concept that imprints our conscience, is the speculative Good Friday as negation of the negative. Let's move on to block 3 now, and we'll take a look at the element of knowledge going from uneducated standpoint to the elevated standpoint. And this is key for understanding Hegel's epistemology. So, 3.1, the education of the uneducated standpoint. Each subjective moment must gain concrete shape and form. Each subjective moment must be posited into objectivity. We pass through 3 stages. Particular determinate spirit. Then we enter into preparatory knowledge of general substance of spirit. And then we reach transfigured spirit as individual. So, block 3, note 2, the elevated standpoint moves from individual to universal. We begin with one predominant outlook, but then we pass through a more inclusive eschatological vision or teleological vision. Our prior inorganic nature is negated, or you could say our prior determinate nature is negated, and our organic nature of spirit is affirmed as the universal. We negate the determinate self. We affirm the universal self. We affirm the elevated self, the self elevated to the level of pure concept, the self elevated to living in the realm of spirit, the self who lives in the realm of positing. And we've talked about it many times, but the realm of positing for Hegel is the realm of spirit. That is where we live. In this realm of spirit, we posit our sign model as an internal externality. It's constructed internally in the inner self, where we put the eidos ideas together into a model going out from the divine and returning to the divine, and then we posit that worldview at the forefront of our mind, at the edge of objectivity, as a filter through which we interpret our culture, through which we interpret our history, through which we interpret our environment. And then we seek to gain, through dialogue, recognition of the true in other human beings, in our culture. We want to lead them toward the recognition of the advantage to entering into the realm of spirit and believing in a realm of spirit and believing in the speculative Good Friday revealed in the cross and resurrection of Christ. Hegel was a believer. Hegel was a Christian believer. Obviously, he's a head of the chair of philosophy in Berlin. So, like all Christians, he's unique in his Christian perspective, but he is Christian. But his Christianity is probably quite a bit different than yours and mine. But he is Christian, and he is a philosopher, and he is the most profound philosopher in modern studies. When we look back, the phenomenology of spirit is considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest work of philosophy ever written. Now, this little book by Kaufmann is a little mini reader. It's a 120-page reader of selected passages in Hegel's phenomenology. It's perfect for a seminar, absolutely perfect. Kaufmann's book is basically it's a little syllabus for a seminar on Hegel. It'd be perfect for that. but it's not really a commentary. It's really translating selections out of Hegel's phenomenology and then doing critical textual translation. So the notes are about translation. They're not really a commentary. So it could be called Hegel, text and textual criticism, I think. But it's very, very good. And I really enjoyed this lesson on epistemology. I mean, it's really keys in on Hegel's view of the element of knowledge. We looked at the logic of the element of knowledge. We looked at the process of Hegel's phenomenology in Block 2. And then I love the fact that for Hegel, our knowledge that transitions from uneducated to elevated is spiritual transfiguration. We enter into the miracle of spiritual transfiguration. Our mind is transfigured. Our knowledge is transfigured. We move from an uneducated standpoint to an elevated spiritual standpoint. I thought that was very well done. And I love the fact that in Block 2, Note 2, we ascend a spiritual ladder from sense certainty, where we begin, to the absolute knowledge of the dialectic within the ether of spirit. We enter into that dialectic within the ether of spirit, and we develop a scientific, systematic grasp of absolute knowledge. And it's dialectical, so it is the movement of self-consciousness, Block 2, Note 3, and we posit and then internalize the return. We posit and then we internalize the return. We posit the truth, then we internalize the return out of objectivity from other selves. Then we refine our element of knowledge. We posit again and again, internalize the next return, and then refine our element of knowledge, and then posit our sign model again, our revised sign model. This goes on and on as a continual dialectic of positing and the return of freedom, positing and the return of freedom, again, again, and again. And Hegel calls this the elevated standpoint of the element of knowledge. We live as those who live in the realm of spirit, as those who live with an elevated standpoint concerning the element of knowledge. We live with a spiritual elevated standpoint. Paul called that living in Christ. That's what Paul called it. Hegel gives it a philosophical definition of living within the spiritual elevated standpoint. Well, to me, that means living within the history of Christ. Or Paul says, en Christos, living in Christ, abiding in Christ. Hegel is a believer. All of this lesson could be interpreted from a perspective of Christian pneumatology, doctrine of the Spirit, but it is a pretty good take from Walter Kaufmann on Hegel's epistemology. How do we know what we know? How do we move from uneducated standpoint of